Welcome to episode 5 of the Seed Growers Podcast. I'm Dan Breezewa, seed grower at Turnasol Cooperative Farm and spreadsheet and crop planning enthusiast. With the Seed Growers Podcast, I want you to get inspired to go out and save some seed on your farm. Rowen White of Sierra Seeds is this episode's guest. Rowen White is a seed keeper and farmer from the Mohawk community of Akwesasne and a passionate activist for indigenous seed and food sovereignty. Rowen grows seed outside of Nevada City in California. In this episode, Rowen talks about stock seed improvement to offset the impact of genetic drift, to select culturally and bioregionally relevant seed that will stand the test of time, about building a relational database with Notion to manage all the information related to Rowen seed work, about seed rematriation, a movement to bring seed back into their mother community so Native people can care for these seeds and reconnect with ancestral seed in meaningful ways, and how seed rematriation opens the doors for us to reckon with complex and uncomfortable things like settler colonialism and its ongoing impact. It opens up doorways to build intercultural relationships between non-native and indigenous peoples and create possibilities for healing and reconciliation. For this episode's technical section, Rowen does a deep dive into 2 seed crops, corn and squash. For both crops, Rowen discusses managing isolation in space and time to avoid cross-pollination, how to create more genetic diversity in these plant populations, and how to harvest, extract, and dry these crops. Rowen also explains exactly how much squash you can get your kids to eat. This episode is sponsored by the Organic Seed Alliance. Organic Seed Alliance is a U.S.-based nonprofit that advances ethical seed solutions to meet food and farming needs in a changing world. OSA's work ensures an abundant and diverse supply of ecologically grown seed, tended in perpetuity by skilled and diverse communities of seed stewards. To advance this mission, we serve growers working with seed at any scale through participatory research, practical education, policy advocacy, and network development. Join our online seed community at organicseedcommons.org, search our resources at seedalliance.org, and read recommendations for advancing organic seed at stateoforganicseed.org. On a personal note, I also want to mention the Organic Seed Conference that OSA puts on every 2 years. I first went in 2008, and I learned so much about growing seed and the business of seed during the conference, and met so many seed growers, breeders, and seed companies. It was the single most influential and formative experience in my seed growing career. If you're serious about seed, you should give it a try. This episode is also sponsored by the Bauta Family Initiative on Canadian Seed Security. Seedheads is the cross-pollinating podcast where Canadian seed heroes tell their stories, share their how-to tips, and talk about the seeds they love. Join Steph Benoit and Hugo Martorell as they host conversations that are both technically useful and personally inspiring, as guests share the myriad ways that seeds are at the center of our lives as growers and eaters. If you're interested in hearing from people who are passionate about saving, stewarding, and sharing seed, subscribe to Seedheads in your favorite podcast app, or go to seedsecurity.ca/podcast and get started with seasons 1 and 2 of Seedheads today. Seedheads is a podcast inspired by Canadian seed growers and hosted by the Bauta Family Initiative on Canadian Seed Security, a program of seed change. Season 3 is coming in 2022, as always, with episodes in French and English. I'm subscribed to the Seedhead podcast, and I can't wait to listen to Season 3. Hi, Rowen White. Welcome to the Seed Growers Podcast.
Hey, how's it going, Dan?
So I'm really happy to have you on the podcast. A lot of this podcast is really focused on how to integrate seed production to market tech gardens, and it gets fairly technical. And I know myself, when I think about seed and I teach about seed, I really tend to go into the mechanics, the economics of seed, the technical seed cleaning part, all that kind of stuff. And I know that's important.
That's why we love you, you know?
Well, thank you. But that's not the reason I chose to work with seed. And I don't think it's the reason that most people choose to work with seed. And one thing that I love when I'm talking with you and I see all the work that you do is it's the way that you sort of rekindle in me all the wonder and awe and magic that all first drew me into seed, and the things that I want to make sure I'm always thinking about when I'm working with seed. And so I think that's something I really want to make sure the listeners of this podcast have, and as they're jumping into a seed journey. So thank you for coming on.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And I hope that doesn't set the bar too high on this conversation either.
No, it's all good.
So, can you tell me a little bit about who you are and the story of how you started working with seeds?
Yeah, I'd love to. So, for those listening, my name is Rowen White. Sego, Sewagwego, Ganyat Dahawa Yungyats. I always like to introduce myself in my native language, which is Ganyat Geha. For English speakers, we're Mohawk people. My people come from a small community called Akwesasne, which is a Mohawk community right on the New York-Canadian border. In fact, half of our community is in Canada, Ontario and Quebec, and half of our community is in New York State. So that's where my family lives and where I'm from. Although currently I reside in Northern California in a small town called North San Juan, where we steward 10 acres. Our farm is called Sierra Seeds, and the focus of our family farm here is to continue to grow rare indigenous heirloom seeds, and also grow new seed stewards and people who love seed and people who want to integrate and remember and rehydrate these seed teachings into their life. I'm also a founder of the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, which is a program of the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. And that's been a huge part of the growing edge of my work, is to continue to as a seed keeper and a seed grower and a seed educator, to continue to focus my efforts as an Indigenous woman in the larger movement towards building the seed commons and growing them again, is to focus my energy and resources to work alongside tribal communities and Native communities on their efforts towards seed sovereignty, and help facilitate conversations and teach workshops and build curriculums that help people to reskill in seed growing and seed distribution, and be thinking, I think, radically and imaginatively and creatively about ways we can grow seed distribution efforts and seed growing efforts in a more regenerative, economical way that doesn't exploit or harm these seed relatives that are beautifully woven into our cosmologies and our cosmovisions. So it's been a real joy to be a founder and help to kickstart the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, which is really just a formalizing of Indigenous trade routes and kinship routes and connections of seed keeping traditions that have been happening here on Turtle Island since time immemorial and here in North America. And so it's been a real joy to help, lay down some more fertile compost and some resources on that work, which is so vital as a part of the larger Indigenous food sovereignty movement and people's desire to reclaim their culturally significant food and seed traditions. So I came to this work as a young woman. I started my seed keeping journey as a 17-year-old young woman who had left my community and ended up on a small organic farm in Western Massachusetts that was a CSA vegetable production farm, and also livestock farm associated with Hampshire College. And that was sort of my first introduction to this idea of heirloom seeds or heritage seeds, and knowing that as Mohawk people, we have been farmers and gardeners since the dawning of our creation and for a long, long time. And there's so many stories there, but farming had been something of a livelihood that my great-grandparents were engaged in. My great-grandfather, Alex, and my great-grandma Rena were farmers on the reservation. My grandparents grew up on farms, but they were disconnected through the residential schools and the boarding schools and the acculturation and colonial tactics to sort of remove the lifeways of our people. And so I'm the first generation over the last couple generations to return to farming as a livelihood and as a big passion of mine. And my particular interface with agriculture has been extremely seed-centric and has been really focused on not only revitalizing relationships with my ancestral seeds, but just really highlighting and underscoring the vital importance of seed saving as a part of a holistic working farm, and have really made seed work my life's work. And I always pay homage to the seeds themselves, my ancestral seeds, and all the other seeds that I have the great fortune of growing here on our indigenous seed bank on our farm. I pay homage to them for being these teachers and guides. And I always say that I apprenticed myself to those seeds, and they grew me into the person that I am today. So they continue to help me understand so many things about life and about the food systems, here in the US. And yeah, I just continue to allow them to guide my work. And so there's a lot of ways in which seeds continue to inform how I show up in the world. That's a little backstory of me. There's a lot of side shoots there, but I have a great enduring love for seed, and ultimately the diversity of seed. And also, maybe we'll even get into talking about this, but the cultural dimension of biodiversity and the way that that shows up in our food landscape, and the lasting legacy of indigenous peoples, and the way in which their ancestral intelligences and geniuses have brought forth some of the most impactful crops that we have in our landscape of nourishment today.
So that's a lot of ways that we can go with this conversation from here. Before getting into the cultural dimensions of biodiversity, maybe we could talk a little bit about the land where you farm. Yeah, so can you describe sort of where you live now and what your current garden farm looks like? And I think before we talked, you referred to it as a farm. And so are you still farming?
Yeah, we farm here. Yeah, we have a working 10-acre farm, about 2 to 3 acres of like cultivatable, tillable acreage, in addition to a beautiful forest. And we live in the Sierra foothills of, the Sierra Nevada mountain range in Northern California. We live in the foothills region, just outside of Nevada City. So this is where the gold rush happened in our region, for sort of a historical context. But it's traditionally the unceded territory of the Nisenan people. And they had a very different kind of agriculture here, which was with the oaks and the acorns, right? They were acorn people. But we farm on a hillside. We have a beautiful sloping southwest exposure. We have a big milpa, we call it our milpa field, or our like kind of Three Sisters field down at the bottom of the hill. But then we've also carved out these kind of large terraces and swales to sort of contour the land, to minimize the erosion from the heavy rains that we get in the wintertime, and to also conserve that moisture for the dry season. Because we live in a climate where we have 4 seasons, but ultimately we really have 2 guiding seasons, which is wet season and dry season. So rainy season, where we get typically 40 to 60 inches of rain every winter. But then we won't get rain from usually May until October. So we'll have a stretch of dry season where we don't get rain at all, which for anyone who is interested or is already experiencing growing seed, that's incredible seed growing conditions to not get rain during the summertime. So we have, like I said, a couple of different, we have like more of like the tractor farm field down below. And then we have more of these like larger sort of hugelkultur swale bed, contour beds in 2 different parts. And then we have an orchard. So our largest focus on our farm in its current incarnation has been focusing on growing stock seed and doing a lot of regenerative work in improving the vitality and diversity in stock seed. So we do a lot of grow outs of rare small lot seeds into larger lots of seed, and then partner with a number of different collaborations where those lots get grown out on much larger acreage. And then that seed gets distributed through our indigenous cooperative network. And we can get into talking about that later. But then we also do some larger grow outs as well in our bigger fields. So we have a kind of dual focus on our farm, which is to have that kind of close touch to those small lots that we're growing out and really doing a lot of seed selection and a lot of focus on there, and then doing some of the little bit further away touch, kind of bigger grow outs in that way. And so we also have a beautiful earthen seed bank that we call our seed kiva here on the land, where we have over 400 different heirloom seed varieties that we tend and steward over the seasons. So we're responsible for ensuring that those seed crops are refreshed and regrown on a certain calendric cycle. So that way we can keep those alive and vital and continue to be a source of diversity for not only our local community, but for the larger indigenous seed network that we participate in. So we have a little bit of a different farming model because we also on our farm host a lot of educational opportunities. So we have in-person classes and retreats, as well as an online class or mentorship. And so we, in some ways, sort of subsidize the seed work that we do through the educational work that we do. And we think that's really important for our relationship to the seeds. And then our seeds, again, we don't do direct sales from our seed farm. We have a bit of a different relationship through this cooperative distribution network that is underwritten by grants and foundation work, because we're really just in this phase of redefining our economic relationship to seeds so that it aligns with our cultural values as Indigenous peoples. So we've been kind of in more of an experimental phase of what that might look like. And many Indigenous peoples don't want to be in a relationship where they're selling seeds. And so I always say we provide evolutionary services to those seeds. We're growing them, we're tending to them, we're caring for them. And so what are the ways in which we as seed keepers can be supported in our livelihood to provide those evolutionary services for those seeds, but in a way that doesn't become transactional and undermine these relationships that we have to the seeds. So that's a little bit of maybe where our seed farming efforts from an economic standpoint might be a little different from, let's say, a production seed grower for a seed company.
That sounds like quite a lot going on those 10 acres. You're working with 400 varieties that you're keeping going, and you're maintaining them on a certain calendar cycle. How often are you growing out these different varieties to replenish your seed stocks and keep them vibrant and vital?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it depends on the crop type. So they're in deep, I wouldn't say dormant, but they're in cold storage. So the life cycle of a seed and the longevity of a seed really depends on, again, that mantra of cool, dark, and dry. And seeds can have a remarkable lifespan when kept in good conditions. So we, and each seed, again, and maybe this has been talked about on the podcast before, but each seed, depending on the size and just some of the specifics of each crop type, have, again, a different sort of shelf life, so to speak. And so we design our grow outs based on some of those variables, some of, the things that we know and have learned over the years. We've been doing the seed keeping work for 25 years and have learned a lot from the seeds themselves and also our larger community of practice in the seed growing work. So again, like, let's say, for instance, like we have probably around 20 corns that we're in relationship with here on the farm. And we rely on not only isolation by space, but also isolation by timing. So we plant out corns. Luckily, we have quite a long season here. I mean, we still get frost and snow here, but we have a long season here. And so we're able to plant successions of corn so that they're not flowering simultaneously. And so we can stretch the number of corns that we can grow out in any one year, as well as, again, as you said, sort of moving with cycles over the years. So if we are growing out a particular corn variety 1 year, it might be 6 to 8 years before we grow that one out again. If we're in maintenance mode with that seed, right? If we're in sort of like making sure that it's staying fresh and the germination rate's up, versus if we're in active selection and seed stock mode, where we're wanting to have a continuum of seasons where we're growing that one out and really making sure that it's adapting to the seasons year in and year out. Some of the seed varieties that we hold in our bank are not always regenerated and grown out on our farm. So we participate in a larger network of seed keepers, indigenous seed keepers and growers. And so sometimes we're also doing like sort of backup storage for different entities, and are just sort of holding seed. And then some of that stock seed is being grown offsite with collaborating partners through our network. So, but yeah, it's a dance. It's, you have your obsession or passion with spreadsheets, and I have a whole, I guess, ecosystem perhaps would be what I would call it. It used to be an Airtable, but I'm actually migrating to Notion, which is a relational database system that helps me to keep track of the grow outs and the cultural information and all of the details and information that we carry as a part of our seed collection. I'm building out a whole relational database that helps those of us here on the farm and those who we share seed with to be able to carry all that information. So that's kind of a dorky offshoot. You might need to dig in there a little at some point.
Well, when I start the spreadsheet podcast, I'm going to have to bring you on and we'll talk about that.
Yeah, relational databases have just totally blown my mind, and it definitely unearths a very nerdy side of myself.
I'll ask one question about this database. Are you working with this database with other people in the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, or is this something that you just is a personal one?
Well, I'm sort of prototyping my own because, again, I recently stepped down this past year from serving on the Seed Savers Exchange Board, but I had a good run. I was there on the board for maybe 7 years and was always so fascinated. They have a giant, like 20,000 plus catalog of rare heirloom seeds. And they have this incredibly complex database, so multifaceted, which of course they have to. And I found that I needed something that would support sort of our scale and also just was buildable so that I could add in the data points or the cultural information that mattered to me, right? As my own, as a part of our own seed keeping efforts. So I've sort of been prototyping using these very flexible and adaptive platforms that exist now digitally to prototype our own visually beautiful seed database that can hold a lot of this information. And then ISKN, the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, has been in listening sessions and conversations and partnerships, even with a couple of universities, to think about how perhaps maybe these individual databases or templates that I'm sort of prototyping might be able to go out to other Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, and maybe they get linked somehow, or maybe this information sort of gets put in, because that's something that I think our larger network has been setting our eyes on, and our goals on is to have a collaborative database where like a searchable database where we understand sort of, who has what seed where. And that was actually grew out of a project that I helped to kickstart and develop at Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance with our Seed Keepers Network endeavors, which was we were creating a process by which people in community could create what we called seed census work. So identifying with the baseline question of what is the state of seed in your community. So being able to train people to basically engage in seed census work in their community and understand what were the varieties of seed that were being grown, what varieties of seed were growing really well in their communities, and sort of crowdsource that information to be able to inform a community about the state of seed and perhaps create a framework for understanding where were the gaps and how did, and that was a part of a larger effort for this seed sovereignty assessment toolkit that we were developing. So some of these database development came out of, I guess, just a need that emerged that for many of us seed keepers to be able to have I guess, knowledge management systems or databases that would help us to put in a lot of this information that we were gathering from our stewardship of the seeds that we care about. So.
That's fantastic. We'll have to chat about that some other time more, but I love that. I want to go back to one other thing you talked about a little bit earlier, which was that you're maintaining stock seed. And what I'm curious about is where the decision to kind of work on these different lots is coming from. Is this something that you're putting forward, or figuring out what needs to be worked on to improve the stock seed or make it more available? Or is this something that's coming from other organizations that know that there's a variety that maybe doesn't have, has, I don't hesitate to say poor genetics, but limited genetics and needs some work?
I think it's probably somewhere in the middle. So as a thought leader and a mentor in the indigenous seed sovereignty work, as one of many, one thing that has been an emergent need in our communities is access to culturally significant seed again, right? To seeds that not only are culturally significant, but also bioregionally significant, things that grow well in different areas. And what we noticed was that in engaging with, some of the seed rematriation work, which I'm sure we'll get the chance to talk about, or ways in which we were uncovering and finding these small, rare lots of seed through seed banks like Seed Savers Exchange, or here in the United States, the GRIN, which is the USDA seed bank, federally funded seed bank. So we were, sourcing and locating seeds that were of interest, both culturally and sort of bioregionally for folks, and also, myself gathering seeds of interest from my own home community and the surrounding Haudenosaunee communities, and recognizing that a lot of these seeds had either genetic drift in terms of there hadn't been humans actively selecting for the strongest and most vital seeds for a long time, or that they, again, had dwindled down to small populations. And as we know, as seed keepers with cross-pollinated crops, if those populations get down really small, they start to exhibit that lack of vitality or that lack of genetic strength. And so I think it just sort of emerged as a niche and a gap and something that needed to be tended to. And as someone who has honed my seed keeping skills, as well as seeing myself as an indigenous plant breeder, as somebody who has an active co-evolutionary relationship to plants in real time, from season to season, it just felt like a real natural niche for us here at CR Seeds to use the skill set that we have, myself and my husband, who's also an incredible observant plant steward as well, to just sort of acknowledge that zone of passion and genius that we have and apply it to this part of the work. So that's where the stock seed work kind of came into our farm ecosystem, was recognizing the need for that, because people would grow out, we'd receive these lots from these various places and see that, or receive gifts of seed from indigenous community members, and these seeds would, like corn lots that had a lot of, just genetic issues, or just, again, that lack of vigor and vitality, and just continued to hone our skills and think creatively about, the restoration of some of these. And so I think that even outside of the indigenous seed community, I don't think the overall seed movement or the seed industry, maybe we should say, especially in the sort of small heirloom organic seed world, focuses enough on stock seed and the quality of stock seed, and how important, like if the quality of your seed grow out, or your food grow out, really depends upon the quality of the seed that you start with. And I've seen a lot of varieties that come from, small seed companies, et cetera, that have a lot of, I think a lot of those lots have a lot of work, to be done to really, sort of enhance the vitality of them and have that really engaged stewardship approach.
Yeah, I think you're totally right about that. So many seed growers that come into this movement have limited farming and limited seed growing knowledge and then limited scientific background. And so there's so many things that they have to figure out at once, that it's, I think you're right. It's one of the challenges that the organic seed movement and the small organic, like bioregional, I guess, seed industry needs to make sure that we are there in the future and that we are preserving the seeds that we think we're preserving and want to preserve.
Yeah. And just, sort of, and again, there's so many different ways to look at it. And maybe when we go into our sort of talking about some of my favorite crops, I'll share a little bit of some of my different perspectives, because I think that there's, maybe some of this work to grow really high quality seed lots and seed grow outs sometimes can be really honed and directed towards a very narrow and specific market or set of desired characteristics. But I guess I'm just sort of always looking to want to grow seed that people just like you and me can grow in our gardens and in our farms that do really well, that are vital and beautiful and tasty and nutritious. And, it's less about that sort of uniformity and that responsiveness to fertilizers, et cetera. It's just like what I love about our seed bank here on our farm is that we have varieties that are a part of our family that we've grown year in and year out that produce such beautiful food and are tasty and are amazing and, are sort of like stand up to the tests of time, and in a very low input organic system with, one aspect of the work that we do, I think, which relates to the seed stock work is that we are in an extremely low input environment where we have hard baked clay soil. We have really limited water. We work on a dryland farming system where we emphasize on selecting for drought tolerant and crops that thrive in a hot, dry environment. And so that's a layer of some of the selection screens or the ways in which we engage with these plants. And in the face of climate change, knowing that, and global warming, knowing that a lot of places, the temperatures are rising and access to good, clean water is becoming an issue, especially in the arid West. And so that feels really important to us to continue to grow seeds under some of those in that low input environment, as well as just being in an arid climate. We also have a very different relationship to disease and blight and other plant pathology issues. So we have an advantage there. And so some ways growing stock seed in these arid climates is really helpful in that way.
Earlier, you mentioned seed rematriation, and this is something that I really wanted to make sure that we talked about. One, because I want to know more about it. It's a concept that I'm learning about and discovering and want to apply in the work that we're doing at our farm. It's also something that I think other seed companies and seed savers should be thinking about. Would you like to talk a bit about seed rematriation?
Yeah. Seed rematriation has been really this growing edge and this sort of, just something that emerged from the body of work that I've been sort of gathering and collecting along the seed path and feel very fortunate to be, one of many people who are articulating about it, talking about it and articulating thoughts and ideas about this. And really, again, it was birthed from a need, which was that as we began to work with indigenous communities around, here in North America, we discovered that a lot of communities had become disconnected from seeds that had cultural significance. And we know that disconnection was because of things like colonization, acculturation, assimilation, relocation, and really challenging and, unspeakable, things that came with settler colonialism here in North America. So many indigenous communities were able to keep some of their seeds and many were not, and so as we began to work inside of the food sovereignty movement, which is a movement to reconnect people back to culturally significant ways of eating and growing in ways that center our autonomy and our agency to be self-determined in what sorts of foods we eat, knowing that the colonial project has had a very manufactured dismantling of our food systems to disempower Native people and to move Native people off their ancestral lands. And so that was one of the biggest needs that emerged in some of this work in saying, okay, if we want to grow our own food and we want to revitalize those traditional foodways, then we, for tribes that were agriculturally based, we needed seed. And some of those folks had seed and maybe, again, small amounts of them because of the cultural upheaval. But some tribes didn't have any of them at all. And so that became clear to me. And so I started to, Dan, as you know, I think we've known each other close to 2 decades. I can't even remember, but I've been involved in the larger organic seed movement for close to 25 years now and have made a real effort to build those intercultural connections with folks because I really believe in an intercultural agriculture and believe in the power of diversity in all realms from seed to people. And so I began to leverage some of those connections from people I met at different seed conferences and farming conferences and be able to make connections with people who were at universities and at seed banks and begin to sort of track down some of these seeds. And so much of what seed rematriation is about finding those seeds where they've moved to. And some of them have been moved, seeds move, and sometimes they move through trade, Native people trading with their settler neighbors. Some of those seeds have moved by force or theft through, any number of ways. But some of those seeds ended up in places like seed banks, like Seed Savers Exchange, or in museums like Field Museum or the Minnesota Museum of Science, or universities like University of Michigan, or various other entities that we've worked with. And so the rematriation piece is sort of a spin on the word repatriation, which is to bring those seeds back into their mother communities, right? And back into their communities of origin so that those seeds can be cared for. Because, for those of you who don't inhabit an indigenous cosmovision or a way of thinking about the world, those seeds and foods have a significant place in our cosmologies and our stories and our ceremonies. And we see them as living relatives, and in many cases, myself included, for the Haudenosaunee cosmology, is that we see ourselves as lineal descendants of our seeds and food, right? We're directly related to them, and so bringing those seeds back in a good way into that living context where Native people can be growing them and caring for those seeds is of vital importance, and that's at the heart of seed rematriation. And there's so many layers to this work. One of the most impactful parts of the seed rematriation work that I've seen is not only seeing Native people reconnect with ancestral seed in meaningful ways, but also it opens a door for us to reckon with things like complex and uncomfortable things like settler colonialism and its ongoing impact on this continent. The concept of diaspora and people, all kinds of people living in diaspora from their cultural communities. And so it opens up doorways for us to build intercultural partnerships between non-Native people who are descendants of settlers and are continuing to settle here, and indigenous peoples who are the first peoples of this land. And under that shade tree of sharing seeds or even growing rematriation gardens where everybody's working together to plant these seeds in ancestral land again, it opens up the doorway of possibility for healing and reconciliation to happen, right? For that to happen and in meaningful ways, and that intercultural dialogue and that trust building and that redistribution of wealth and resources and offers, I think, a real tangible and practical way for a kind of reparations, I think, if I could say it that way. And so I think that there's lots of ways in which seed rematriation shows up. Like, for instance, it might be in these partnerships that Indigenous Seed Keepers Network is helping to facilitate between institutions and tribal entities or initiatives or individuals, like Native individuals. But it also, there's another layer of it and another spin on it where, seed companies who might have a catalog full of different seed varieties that have provenance or origins from indigenous communities. And what is the responsibility of those seed companies to acknowledge those origins and document them, whether it's in the seed descriptions, et cetera, but also have some benefit sharing, right? And that's something that I sort of, a phrase or something that I sort of coined years ago when I was engaging with organic seed company folks, was indigenous seed benefit sharing. So if seed companies are benefiting from the sale of varieties that perhaps have indigenous provenance, then how is some of that profit or some of that those resources tied back or sent back to indigenous communities to support their seed sovereignty and food sovereignty efforts? So there's been a number of ways in which different folks have taken that on. I know that Fedco has their indigenous royalties program where they identify seeds in their catalog that have indigenous provenance, and then the percentage of the sales of those varieties then get returned to indigenous entity of choice. So I think that there's a number of different ways in which that can show up in the commercial realm, in the commercial seed realm. And that's something that I've been in conversation with folks from that realm about. So I think it's a growing movement. It's a growing edge of thinking about the importance of seeds being in a living context, being inside of a caring community of origin. And so I think it's just sort of the beginning of us, as we, I guess, all collectively perhaps are moving towards growing out the seed commons and what that might look like here in this continent. And what I'll say maybe in closing about seed rematriation is that it offers an opportunity for the larger seed community to invite in and center indigenous voices and thought leadership and perspective that perhaps might influence and impact the way in which the larger seed movement and the larger seed network and the larger seed, I don't like to use the word industry, but I guess it is what it is. It might influence the way in which seed distribution happens, here on this continent. And I think we're at a time where if we want to think about the future of food and what that might look like and have it be a just, equitable food system, we have to think about those sorts of things and the role that indigenous peoples can play in the movement.
Well, thank you for going into that. I really appreciate it.
Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here. The goal of No-Till Growers is to help produce and create valuable niche content like what you're listening to now. We create several different podcasts, from the Winter Growers podcast hosted by Clara Coleman to the Collaborative Farming podcast with host Jackson Roulette and many more. We produce videos at the No-Till Growers YouTube channel, including farm tours and crop-specific breakdowns. And our entire model is to create helpful, valuable farming content that is free and open to the public, so anyone, anywhere can use it. So if you appreciate that and our work, or are simply enjoying this show, please consider signing up to be a patron at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers. There are also other support options at no-tillgrowers.com, or you can even purchase a copy of my book, The Living Soil Handbook, because when you purchase it directly from no-tillgrowers.com specifically, the proceeds go to making you more amazing content like this. Okay, that's my spiel. Thanks, you all. Back to the show.
So in each episode, I like to go into sort of the expertise and the knowledge and the techniques of growing seed. And we talked about a couple crops that you might like to talk about. And so you talked about discussing corn and also discussing squash. Is there one you'd like to go into first?
Well, let's see. I think I'll start with corn and then follow up with squash, because they're just, there's two different takes that I can share. Corn is important to me as an ancestral crop. As a Mohawk woman, corn is a central part of our ancestral seed bundle, and so it's been really important for me to reconnect in meaningful ways to indigenous corn varieties, and so corn has a special place in my heart. And we have been thinking a lot about looking at the inherent need that has emerged to engage in sort of a population approach to seed stewardship with corn as it relates to the restoration of some of these heirloom corn varieties that perhaps have had some of that genetic drift or have had some of that genetic narrowing because of sort of the history of things. So definitely wanted to talk shop a little bit about what that might look like, seed saving, on our farm and how we do that.
How would growing corn with the intention of stock seed be any different than growing it with the intention of using it as a food?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, when we save seed, just in general, whether it's for stock seed or just a larger grow out, corn is cross-pollinating. So if you're growing it in any proximity to other varieties of corn, they can easily cross-pollinate if they're flowering at the same time. So we live at the end of a dirt road. We seed keepers, we like isolation and maybe in lots of ways, but and so we have quite a distance from anybody else who's growing corn in the larger region. So that's important, is to be thinking about where are you growing your corn, and are there people, neighbors or people in your midst who are growing corn. We also live in a sort of forested region, so pollen is not drifting across like large prairies here. We have a lot of forest and hedgerows that would impact the sort of migration of pollen across the landscape. So we have actually experimented even in our 10 acres, even though our 2 fields that we would grow corn in are, in seed saving manuals, sometimes you'll see seed, the recommendation that corn be grown, miles apart from one another, because in Iowa, if you're growing it, in the prairie, the corn pollen is traveling. But we've even experimented over the years with the different wind patterns and the different landscape that we can actually get away with corn simultaneously being flowering, but removed from just, on 2 corners of the property, which is there's not miles in between there. I don't know exactly what the distance is, but a few thousand feet. But because of the landscape with hedgerows and the wind patterns, that we see no cross-pollination happening. So again, you can isolate by space from different varieties, and we also heavily rely on isolation by timing. So we just ensure when we're growing out multiple different varieties of corn of different characteristics, that we're growing them, we're cycling them. Corn has a window of pollen shed and receptivity on the silks, just a couple week window, and so we will grow one corn, the longest season corn. So corn, typically, the corns that we grow mature anywhere from, we have short, like 60 to 70 day corns, all the way to 120 day corns. So we will pick our longest seed corn for that year and grow it as early as we can. Here we can get corn in the ground in late April. And then we'll wait several weeks, usually 3 to 4 weeks, and we'll plant the second succession of corn. And then we oftentimes grow 3 successions of corn and then wait another 3 to 4 weeks and then plant another. We actually plant guided by lunar cycles. So we plant always in the waxing gibbous phase. So it's between first quarter and full moon. And so we just sort of wait until that cycle comes back around each time, and we can get 3 successions in. Yeah. And so we're just making sure that they're flowering, during different times. And then the approach that we like to take with our corn is, again, planting it out in a large enough, sometimes we might only have 200 seeds of a particular corn, right, that we've received. Sometimes we have, 200 pounds of a seed that we've been maintaining for a long time and have a large population from which to draw. So when we're growing out a small lot like that into a larger lot, we're putting it in the field kind of close to us so we can keep a good eye on it. And we've also been experimenting. This is something that I kind of wanted to talk about, is actually doing population crosses. So in varieties that have been shown, small lots that have been shown to have a lot of inbreeding and sort of lack of vigor because of inbreeding or, just small population over a length of time. Some of the varieties that are coming from the USDA seed bank and other seed banks like that have just been small lots grown out over a number of years. We actually sometimes find varieties that have perhaps similar provenance, like maybe in the same region. Like for instance, we grow a lot of 8-row corns. So we might find a variety that has similar characteristics, that have 8 rows, that have similar maturation, etc. And we actually have been experimenting with doing some population crosses, and then over time sort of continuing to select for some of the original characteristics of that original heirloom seed, but to reintroduce a little bit more diversity into the corn.
Can I ask a question there? Let's say you had only 200 seeds of a variety. Would you grow it first on its own in isolation before reintroducing?
So usually we're doing sort of an evaluation of sort of like getting a sense of where the corn's at. Looking at, like, again, just some of those markers around vigor and vitality. And, sometimes corn, when it's starting to drift or get inbred, there's like characteristics like the tassels will sometimes turn into ears. Like there's just little things that you start to notice that are just sort of mutations, I guess, that emerge. And so we'll sort of do that evaluation round to sort of test the corn, and then we'll sort of choose our own adventure from there. If it looks good, then we'll just keep running with that and continue to, plant larger lots until we can get a bigger population. And then we may have to go into, I guess, triage mode and sort of do that population integration.
So the two questions I'd like to ask you, the next questions would be related to this, is how does like a selection and looking at the plants, how does that look? Or how do you do that during the growing? And then at what point do you know that the corn is ready for harvest?
Yeah, that's great. So we select in multiple ways, right? So we're selecting throughout the growing season. So there's a selection that's happening when we're planting the corn and like what corn's popping up. Sometimes we grow 2 or 3 in each hole, and then we thin out for the most vigorous ones, so you're selecting for that good emergence, especially in a low water situation. So oftentimes we're sort of testing a little bit of that like dryland farming or lower water conditions. So you have a layer of selection that's happening there, right? With that initial thinning. Then you're sort of paying attention. And that's, I think, one of the biggest things that seed keepers have a part of their natural toolkit is this sort of, I call it, there's a reverent curiosity, or there's like an observation that we have, like our skills of observation, to just notice like what pops out at varieties when they're growing, their stature, for instance, corn, paying attention to how swiftly they're growing, knowing that there's like lots of variables in the environment that impact that. It's not just genetic, but, and then as we get towards tassel emergence and pollen shed, some of our varieties, it's so amazing. Like this variety that we grow, Navajo robin's egg corn, the Navajo people have pollen as a part of their ceremonial ways, and that corn has been selected for pollen production, and they actually specifically grow it to collect pollen from this particular corn, and it has these like giant tassels. It's just like such a really culturally specific characteristic that most people wouldn't notice or wouldn't care about, but that's a part of their corn cycle that matters to them, that they gather that pollen and that it's copious and there's a lot of it. And so you're noticing along the ways, for us, it's just noticing like what plants are vital and vigorous, and marking them and staking them and taking notes and paying attention. And then, as the ears develop and as they begin to, we grow largely flint and flower corns here. We grow a few dents, and we don't really grow sweet corn, but we will, as the husks sort of begin to dry down, we'll begin our harvest process. So with dry corn, with flint and flower corns, it's typically the outer husks begin to dry down. The kernels, when you pull down the husks and sort of poke your fingernail into the kernel, they're no longer milky and can dent in the outer seed coat of the corn is hardening. And so there's a certain point where the corn is ready to harvest, which again is about sort of looking at that seed hardness and its ease in detaching from that cob in that way. And then we harvest and husk and dry. And then there's another layer of selection that happens based on cob length, cob color, shellability of the corn, some of the like culinary characteristics, so there's like so many points at which we as seed keepers are engaging with these plants and engaging in this coevolutionary selection, of saying, what is it that we like? What are the characteristics that we want in this corn, So for every variety, there's like kind of a different sort of checklist of what it is that we're looking for. I mean, there's the baseline sort of vitality and vigor and perhaps yield if there's multiple ears per stalk, etc. But then, with each different variety, there'll be different things that we're paying attention to.
So what does harvest look like, and what happens next to dry down and maybe process or to clean the seed?
Yeah. So if we're doing, I guess at any scale grow out, we're going through the field and picking we're actually doing the initial round of seed selection versus, food selection right there in the field. So if we're doing, a hard selection, we're gathering the seed corn. We have pack baskets. We're throwing them into there. We're hauling them to the end of the field and put them in the trailer of the varieties that we're saving for seed, for instance, and leaving the rest to be processed for food. And again, when you're selecting, like doing more hard selection for seed stock, that's what happens. Is that it's not just a take all. Like when we're doing just a grow out, a regenerative grow out, we will take all of this, a vast majority of that field for seed. But when we're doing that more selection, we're being a little bit more discerning. So we'll harvest out the seed corn and the seed cobs, and then come back through and harvest for the food. And then we'll take it up to our barn area where we'll, husk, sit around and husk all that corn. Corn is a lot of work. We don't mechanize it here. We do partner, Indigenous Seed Keepers Network partners with a couple of entities that have like combines and, all the mechanization as it relates to corn harvest. But we have a very hands-on approach to this work. And so we husk it down. In some instances, we're braiding the corn. Traditionally, we would braid corn to dry and store it, which we do at times. And then sometimes we're just laying it out sort of in like on these big sort of screen tables that sort of serve as our sort of drying area for the seed corn to dry down. And then we have sort of an old-fashioned antique hand sheller that will shell the corn and get it off the cob. Usually we allow it to stay on the cob for at least a month after harvest. Sometimes just because of time constraints, it might even be more than that. But there is an importance for those cobs to really kind of really dry down and those seeds to suck as much energy as they can from the cobs and really cure in that way. And then we'll shell them down and put them into storage. So. But we have a very dry climate, which is maybe different from some of the other climates here on the continent where we have things dry. Drying is not an issue here. Like things dry rapidly.
You don't need to bring it. You don't need to bring it into the greenhouse to keep it out of the water and maybe add a little heat.
No, like we just have seeds kind of everywhere. I mean, again, we have barn cats that keep with the rodents away. So, but we feel very fortunate in that way.
Is there anything else you want to mention about corn before we talk squash?
Mostly just I think it's important to remember that corn loves diversity. And so if you are in relationship to corn and stewarding corn as you're selecting for all these good things about the corn, we keep our corn populations with a lot of inherent diversity in them, because that's part of our toolkit in the face of climate change, is to have seed varieties that have a lot of inherent diversity, which allows them to be very adaptive and thrive in a multitude of different conditions. So that's an invitation, I think, for us to be thinking about this more population stewardship of corn as opposed to pedigree and plant by plant, is to be thinking about the importance of that larger family of corn that you're growing and stewarding and adapting to your particular land. And so just remembering that corn really does love that diversity, and you sometimes don't always know like what all those little quirks and characteristics inside of a corn might hold. So just, paying attention and making sure you're not selecting too narrow and too hard in your corn seed keeping. So.
That's a really important point. Corn is like one of those super outcrossers.
Indeed. And squash is a little bit more forgiving. Squash is a cross-pollinating crop, but you need a little less of sort of a population numbers and population diversity in squash, which makes it a fun one to grow in combination with corn. Squash, we grow a lot of winter squash here. We do grow some summer squash as well. Squash amazingly has sort of 4 different species. So the Cucurbita genus is the squashes that we're familiar with in our gardens. But there's 4 particular species that we have. We have the Cucurbita moschata, we have the Cucurbita maxima, we have the Cucurbita pepo, and then we have Cucurbita gyrosperma, which is sort of like that cushaw type squash. And so we typically will grow at least 3 species of squash in any one season in our seed fields, because we know that they won't be having that sort of interspecies crossing there. And so squash take up a lot of space, vining squash that are winter squash take up a lot of space. And so we typically want to be growing baseline, 30 to 40 plants. But, we don't need like hundreds and hundreds of squash plants to maintain good diversity in our crops. And, the good thing about squash is if you're growing it in isolation from, so say you have a moschata squash, like a Canada crookneck squash, that's kind of a progenitor or something similar to the butternut squashes that you may be familiar with. If you're growing that, just making sure that you're not growing another crop variety that is in that same genus and species. Like you couldn't grow a butternut or a Long Island cheese pumpkin in proximity during the same season, and likewise for the other species. But you're just growing it out, and that you're saving the seed essentially at the same time that you're harvesting it for food. And so, on our homestead, I think my kids have had their lifetime fill of eating winter squash. Like some seasons we'll grow these giant squashes. We have this one in our collection that's called Buffalo Creek. We've kind of reclaimed the name. Some people call it Boston Marrow, but it's a large orange Hubbard squash that can grow dozens of pounds per squash. And we have great memories of having just stacks of those in our home. And those years, the Buffalo Creek years, the kids sicken of eating winter squash in every meal because we can double dip. That's the cool part about winter squash, is that you can double dip. You can harvest the seeds and scoop them out of the flesh, and then you can also eat the fruit for in your pumpkin soups and your pies and things like that. So we're oftentimes trying to find ways to make sure that we're utilizing both the seed and the food. Yeah, I kind of want to talk a little bit about stockseed, mostly because I think what's interesting to me about growing squash and why I wanted to share a little bit about this as a crop to talk about today was that we've been experimenting lately with creating modern day grexes. A grex is a Latin term for, it actually literally means flock, but it's sort of a modern day landrace where there's a pretty extreme spectrum of diversity in one population or variety. So it kind of stretches our imagination for, I guess it just pushes up against sort of this modern obsession with purity, which again, in a lot of my writing, I sort of kind of try and push against that and really reclaiming the value of diversity. And that is the root of our resilience as humans, is that diversity. And I am a student of diversity. And so what we've been doing a lot and playing around with on our farm is going back to creating these really diverse breeding pools for squash. So this particular year, one area of our seed collection that I feel like we're lacking in is having a really good open pollinated kabocha squash. We love kabocha squash, and it's like that nutty, chestnutty, beautiful flavor, beautiful texture. And so this year, we did this a few years back with all kinds of different butternut squashes, but we're basically pooling together all kinds of different kabocha squash lots from different folks who shared them with us. And we're actually growing them out as in this first season to sort of create our own population grex or a population landrace, so that we can have, I guess, just sort of a mixture of those different phenotypes or those different characteristics that we love in kabocha squash, and to kind of create that, I guess, just that choose your own adventure population breeding pool that perhaps we share with other people, and they will be able to draw out different characteristics and just have fun in seed keeping and be able to see all these different combinations from these different kabocha type squashes and see how they mix. And this year we're actually adding in some hybrids. So we actually got some hybrid seeds from different seed companies and are throwing them in there too, because those actually have some really interesting phenotypes and characteristics that I'm interested in. So this might be sort of a longer term sort of reclamation or dehybridization of those by throwing them into our hybrid, into our grex or our breeding pool for kabocha squash. And we're just going to play around with that. So it's just like a little bit of, it's a different approach. It's sort of, instead of convergence, like so much of selection is this convergence of distilling and selecting and honing in on certain skills. And sometimes I think there's an invitation, especially for those of us who see ourselves as plant breeders or amateur plant breeders or indigenous plant breeders, to have some fun with divergence and let's pull together a bunch of different varieties and, that are of the same species, and see what happens when we allow them to play around and to be in that population cross. So I get really excited when I think about it.
I'm really glad you talked about this. I had seen a picture on your Instagram about a mother pool of kabocha squash. So I really like hearing more about it right now. So does this mean you're looking at squash all through the summer? Like once this, maybe you're looking at the plants also, but then maybe you're starting to look at the fruit at a certain point, and then you're harvesting a bunch of different fruit. I don't know if maybe you're marking on them with a Sharpie and then bringing them in the house.
Well, yeah. What we have to remember is that the fun part doesn't happen until next year, right? So this year we're going to be growing out the different varieties, but the phenotypes that we're going to see this year are going to be similar to the parent variety, right?
Right. This is year one. This is year one of it. You're making the grex.
Yeah, we're making the grex. So this year we get to see, like, it's going to be a lot less work this year, right? We're just sort of selecting for what we're seeing in those mother plants, the cool, getting to know some of the varieties that are in here and the characteristics. But it's not until year two, because it's what's inside of those, seed cavities that holds all the interesting different coded crosses between all of those different plants, right? So in year two is where the fun begins, because then you start to plant them out and see what crosses happened, right? And what's happening at that fruit level. So again, this is sort of a longer term endeavor and choose your own adventure with seed keeping.
And I know it hasn't happened yet, but does this mean that your kids will be eating a lot of squash and you'll be saying, is this your favorite one? Is this your favorite one?
Yeah, exactly. I know they'll be subjected to that. Thankfully, they're teenagers now and they have lots of friends, and I don't think they're so completely horrified by the work we do. They love it. It's written on their heart, and they do love squash. I think it's just a certain point in the season where maybe they don't like squash. I remember my son when we were doing a big zucchini seed grow out, and I was doing a lot of early, I wanted to harvest the young zucchinis early so that we could let the plants get a little bigger and then let the seed set happen. So we were culling a lot of the young zucchinis. And I remember my son saying, when is zucchini season going to be over? I think he was just ready for zucchini season to be done. That was when he was younger. But so, yeah, lots of taste testing. Again, we are all about flavor. We're all about texture. We're all about sort of multi-sensory selection here. So
recently, I interviewed another grower, and so she is growing 2 acres of cucurbits, and her name's Mary Claude, and she's splitting them with a wood splitter and then using a shop vac to extract the seed. But she's going through a lot. How different is what you're doing to this?
Yeah, we use a hatchet. We use a hatchet. We also can use sort of a fixed sort of wedge, on a workspace to just sort of kind of create that initial sort of squash, breaking open the seed cavity. If we're doing a mass, again, it just depends on what scale it is that we're doing. So if we're doing like a big grow out, then we're doing it more kind of like, hatchet and scooping seeds out into buckets, and getting them to ferment, because with seeds like squash, it's helpful to have a light fermentation on the seeds. I have found that squash seeds in particular are pretty sensitive to the duration of fermentation. So introducing water and allowing them to sort of sit, but if you let them sit too long, I find that it really degrades the seed coat quality over time. So I've been trying to be mindful of that. And I don't know if that's just because when we're doing it, it's usually pretty hot here.
Do you have a duration that you think is too long for a ferment?
I mean, for us, I would never let it go past a day or two. Like we really only need like a day or two of fermentation for squash seeds. If it starts to get into like day 3 or 4, I start to see market quality decreasing. Again, it just has to do with, I think, the actual fermentation starting to sort of degrade the seed coat. But again, it also depends. Like if it's I see it a lot in Peppo, because they just have that, like, it's a little bit of a less of a seed coat versus Maxima, so again, it really depends. But again, if it's a smaller lot of seed and we're doing sort of these testing things and things like that, it's seed to kitchen. We're bringing those fruits into our kitchen. We're cutting them open. We're cooking with them. We're scooping the seeds out and just integrating it into our food preparation here. So so it just depends on the scale. And then we'll ferment those seeds for a couple days in some water and buckets. We love paint strainer bags, work really well over either the quart size ones over if we're doing smaller lots, or the 5-gallon size ones over the 5-gallon buckets, because it keeps out the fruit flies or any other rodents or critters that might want to take a dip into those into those things. And then they also work really well to strain out the seeds on the other end. And then we'll kind of do a final rinse on the seeds, do the water winnowing and the final rinse, and then we'll just lay them out onto seed screens. We have large seed screens here that we set up in a shaded area. Again, we have very, very low percentage of relative humidity here, so seeds dry really swiftly. We just get some aeration going and they'll dry.
So what would you tell your younger seed-saving self?
What would I tell my younger seed-saving self? I think I'd tell her to just continue to just be patient. I mean, so much of seed work is slow work, it's beautiful, and just honing. I mean, I think there was just a natural inherent patience that you develop as when you apprentice yourself to seeds and to food. And, I think back over the last 25 years of being in relationship to seed, and I think there was, many of those years where I was a young mother and juggling a lot and doing a lot. And so I think, probably what I would tell her would be just to slow down and enjoy the moment. But, again, when you're a mom and you're chasing toddlers and you're doing this and that, it's kind of hard. But I think, we did the best we could. But I think largely I've grown myself into the type of person who at 17 I really needed in my life. And because I did apprentice myself a lot to seeds and a lot to other humans too, but I've done my best to grow myself into somebody who can work with young people, in that very formative stage of their life as teenagers and young adults who want to get into this work, and perhaps be a good mentor and a good guide for them.
Oh, I love that. What would you say to market growers who are growing vegetables or herbs or flowers? What would you say to them to inspire them to start saving seed?
Well, I think that being able to find even just one variety or a couple of ways in which you can close those loops inside of your whole farm system to save seeds, I think maybe this sounds like esoteric, but it brings a different energy to the farm, and it brings a different relationship between you, and a more engaged relationship between you and that plant, because I always say we're plant midwives. We're sort of stewarding plants from one generation to the other. And so there is you're engaging in reciprocity and in a beautiful, engaged, co-evolutionary relationship to seeds. And even if it's just 1 or 2 varieties, you're deepening your connection not only to that seed, but to the land itself, and being able to sort of see the life cycles of these plants. And again, engage in that reverent curiosity for all the different shapes and ways they grow beyond that sort of harvestable stage as a vegetable or a flower or an herb. And I think you just gain an increased sense of reverence for, I guess, just the power of the life cycle of a seed and the power of a seed and the inherent benevolence and generosity of a seed. And so I think every farm should have at least one or two crops that they steward from seed to seed each year and have a part of their farm collection. And I imagine, I think you're one of those folks, Dan, is that you start with one or two, and then pretty soon, you kind of get, caught by the seed saving or seed keeping bug. It really kind of grows on you, and it deepens the connection to the work that you're doing. So I would just invite folks to at least try, even if it's just something simple and easy, to integrate one or two seed crops into their seasonal cycles. In closing, I just think it's so important. A large part of my work is about inspiring the love and the heart of this, right? The love and the connection and kinship and relationship that we have to this work. And each and every one of us descends from people who, you have ancestors in your lineage who kept seeds and saved seeds and had a relationship to seeds. And perhaps those varieties of foods played roles in your cosmology or your ceremonies or your stories from whomever your people are, in your lineages. And so as we work together to envision and build a more irresistible future of food with seeds playing an important foundational part of it, what are the ways in which we can draw upon and rehydrate and reconnect people just like you and me to that ancestral connection to seed? I always say that people they carry in their blood and their bones the agreements that their ancestors made with seed a long time ago. And so it's important to remember that if we ate today, or if you're growing seed in your garden, that those seeds never stopped caring for you. They always upheld their side of the agreement to take care of you and to take care of us as humans. And so what are the ways in which we as living humans now who want to contribute to a more just and beautiful and equitable seed and food system, what are the ways in which we're engaging in reciprocity and care with the seeds, that we grow and in our midst? And sometimes we find those connections through ancestral ways, and sometimes it's just through our multiple senses and our excitement and our as a pleasure activism and the way that we love engaging with food and seed, but just to try and find those meaningful connections and reweave ourselves back into those meaningful relationships with seed and food, because that is actually what is going to create a more sustainable revolution of the food system that we have now, is that if people care and people love these seeds as relatives and love the earth as mother. And so that's my vision and hope for the seed commons, is that people, non-native people especially, continue to do the work to understand what it means to be in kinship with seeds.
I think that those are great closing words, and I think that's a great invitation to people to develop to further that relationship with their seeds. Rowen, where can people find out more about you?
Yeah, well, I have sort of a microblog approach to Instagram, so I'm always snapping pictures on the farm of things that I find beauty and kind of maxing out the captions on my Instagram and writing there. So you can find me in just Rowen White on Instagram. And I also have been building a Patreon community where we have book clubs and I write longer form essays. I'm in the midst of writing a couple of books right now. So some of my longer form essays show up in the Patreon space. And then you can find us. So that is just, if you look on Patreon, if you just look up my name, you'll find me. And then our website is crseeds.org, and you can find out more about our online programming. We have an online mentorship. We do some leadership cohorts of people who are involved in seed and food work and want to hone in their, leadership skills. So, and that's easy enough to find on the internet. So.
Well, thank you so much, Rowen, for sharing this conversation with me, and I hope you have a fantastic season. And That's episode 5 of the Seed Growers Podcast. We're halfway through season 1. A huge thanks to Rowen White for being on the podcast and for all the knowledge she shares everywhere she goes. You can find Rowen on Instagram and read more about all Rowen's work at sierraseeds.org. You can support her work through Patreon. A huge thanks to Sophie Sedelton for the theme music. You can hear more of their music at sophiesedelton.com. The Seed Growers Podcast is produced in part by no-till growers with the help of our sponsors, the Bauta Family Initiative on Canadian Seed Security and the Organic Seed Alliance. A huge thanks to Jackson Roulette and Jesse Frost of No-Till Growers for making this podcast happen and making so many other great farming podcasts happen. You can find more seed growing resources on my blog at goingtoseed.net. While you're there, you can subscribe to my newsletter full of seed growing, crop planning, and farm spreadsheets. If you haven't already subscribed to this podcast, now's the time. You wouldn't want to miss the next episode. Until then, happy farming.